Martin Webster. Thank you, Jeremy. Ladies and gentlemen, I speak as a lifelong adherent of the British nationalist cause, or at least since I was a 17-year-old 53 years ago. Over the past 3 or 4 years, my contribution to this forum were directed to what I regard as the greatest single threat to the British people and nation, organised Jewry in all its various manifestations. On this occasion I will approach a quite different topic, but one which I hope will be of equal importance: the impact on the nationalist movement of Christian religious faith groups, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, and especially its various traditionalist factions. During the past couple of years, the London Forum has been host to a number of speakers from home and abroad, whose speeches, though given political sounding titles, though interleaved with political references and issues, did not have at their core the cause of national, racial and cultural survival, which is what British nationalism is all about. The fundamental purpose was the furtherance of religious beliefs and the recruitment of individuals to membership of the church which promotes those beliefs. The main strategy of these missionaries to achieve such recruitment among nationalists is the suggestion that the church, or their particular traditionalist fragment of it, has beliefs in common with the nationalist movement, which makes nationalism and Catholicism but two fingers of the same hand. It is my purpose to show that such a suggestion is based on a mixture of superficial similarities and downright untruths concocted to gull the naive. At this point I should explain that I'm not talking about nominal or cultural Christians of any and all denominations who try to lead decent lives, who attend Christmas Eve carol services and traditional rites of passage through life, church baptisms, church weddings and church funerals, mumbling along with such of the prayers and hymns as they can remember from their school days. Likewise, I'm not talking about devout Christian believers for whom worship, either alone or in the companies of like-minded people, is an aid to leading a decent, useful life. But it is not the whole part of their whole lives, not a fixation which dominates their every waking moment. I'm talking about the zealots, whose particular sets of religious beliefs dominate their minds and their lives to a great or total extent, affecting their thinking on every intellectual issue. For the zealots, religious beliefs trump every other kind of belief, including, one might say especially, the realm of politics. The zealots have something in common with alcoholics and other addicts. They seek self-validation by recruiting others to their cause. They, of course, dignify this approach by calling it missionary work. Not content with God bothering on their own account, they are convinced it is their duty to enjoin others into their state of mind. For all I know, this may well create for the Almighty, if he, she or it exists, a constantly increasing and intrusive adorational nuisance. I would have noted this involvement by Roman Catholic zealots had my background been Church of England, Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, or indeed methylated spiritualist. But I am particularly sensitive to it, since I was brought up a Roman Catholic, attended Roman Catholic schools, which gave me a thorough grounding in Roman Catholic indoctrination. I attended 3 secondary schools, the final one being named after St. Columba, run by a brothers of a Catholic teaching order, in which I was drilled in apologetics. That is, learning the arguments to confound criticism of Roman Catholic dogma. The impact on me of all this was counterproductive from the Church's point of view. I ceased being a Roman Catholic at the age of 15 and evolved as an agnostic. Contrary to the impression I may have given so far, my purpose this afternoon is not to make an anti-religious diatribe. All of us seek a formula to help us cope with the certainty of death and the uncertainty of what may or may not be beyond death. Resort to this, that or the other religion as an aid to coping with this issue is the right which I uphold, along with the right of free speech and the right to exercise from time to time, an equal say, along with my fellow countrymen and women, in who shall govern us. If, as a Baptist, you wish to console yourself with the concept of predestination, that is, the notion that all those who are destined for heaven are chosen at or before their birth, and that nothing any individual may do during the course of his or her life can alter that destiny, which to my mind is subversive of the notion of free will, personal responsibility, and the codes which make civilized human society possible. If, as a Roman Catholic, you find comfort in the belief that the words from a priest can enact transubstantiation, that is, the conversion of bread and wine into the actual body and blood of Christ, regardless of there being no change in molecular construction of the bread and wine after the priest has uttered the words of consecration, and despite the fact that within hours of being ingested by the communicant, those molecules, be they God or bread or wine, will join the residue of other nourishment to be vacated from the bowel or the bladder. If you wish to believe in these notions, only two of perhaps thousands of items of dogma associated variously with hundreds of Christian denominations, then that is entirely a matter for you. In matters of faith, you are free to believe what you like. I would only ask that you recognise, 1, that faith is a wish to believe in that which cannot be proved. 2, the depth of your belief does not constitute proof of the belief, nor did it constitute a license, A, to impose your belief on others, or B, to inflict sanctions on those who refuse to be imposed on, or C, to demand special privileges, including the right not to be offended by expressions of scepticism, disbelief, or even derision, in the way that Jewry, replicating Christian intolerance, demands that the dogma of Holocaustianity be unquestioned and that heretical Holocaust deniers be subject to criminal sanctions. So discussion of religious dogma is not my purpose this afternoon. My purpose is to refer to, firstly, some events and people from within my own personal knowledge during the course of my 53 years involvement with the nationalist movement in Britain, and 2, some events, ideas and people in recorded history during the course of the last 2,000 years, to demonstrate that 1, the Church itself is a sovereign political power institution, like a nation or a global corporate entity. 2, the Church, just like nations or global corporate entities, or the princes discussed by Machiavelli, is primarily interested in its own survival and the furtherance of its own power. 3, on all occasions when nations, political movements and individuals have allied themselves to the Church, they have always ended up either being betrayed and oppressed or becoming sycophantic careerists and patronage seekers. I now turn to matters arising from my own personal experience. Shortly after I joined the National Front in 1969, I was manning the office there with Cathy Huggett, who was A.K. Chesterton's employee, managing the Candour Publishing Company at that time. And I took a call from Oberon Waugh. Many of you may have heard of Oberon Waugh. He's dead now. He got involved in a machine gun accident, not during hostilities, and it left him continuously badly injured, and he took up journalism and writing. His father was Evelyn Waugh, yes, quite right. And he rang up and said, "Oh, can I speak to Leslie, please?" And I, "Sorry, Leslie?" "Oh, Leslie Green." And I remembered that Leslie Green was a very active member of the League of Empire Loyalists, and she worked for Chesterton at that office some years before. I said, "Look, sorry, she's not. She doesn't work here now. And now this is the office of the National Front. How can I help you?" "Oh, well, you probably know that there's a civil war going on in Biafra, and that the breakaway state is the people there are Roman Catholics, And Leslie is a very keen Roman Catholic, as if you knew her, you would probably know about that. And I know her very well, he said. And we wondered if your organisation would help me. I intend to stand in a parliamentary by-election in support of the Biafrans. I said, excuse me, we are the National Front. We are a nationalist political party. We're a nationalist political party. We don't take up foreign causes that are none of Britain's business. And that we wouldn't countenance using a penny of British treasure, such as it remains, or a drop of British blood in involving this nation and its armed forces and its people in a squabble in an African country just on the basis that one of the factions involved, you say, is predominantly Roman Catholic. Oh, that's your attitude, is it? Bang. The phone went down. I didn't think anything more about this until probably more than a year or so later, when I noticed that Private Eye was continually savaging the National Front, with material in from Jerry Gable, a lot of stories from him, the man who ended up running the Searchlight organisation. Also, there were a lot of nasty articles from a man called Martin Walker, who was also writing a gossip column in The Guardian at that time. And I just couldn't understand why Private Eye had got such a needle into the National Front. And then I realised, of course, who was one of the main writers on Private Eye but Oberon Waugh. And he decided, and the editor of Private Eye at the time, Richard Ingrams, though not a Roman Catholic, is High Church of England and closely involved with Roman Catholics through his interest in G.K. Chesterton. And they really did feel that they didn't like the National Front had taken over from the League of or had been merged by Chesterton with the old British National Party, the original British National Party, to form the National Front. And frankly, they were going to use their publication. They were out to get us. And I thought, all this because we wouldn't support a Catholic war in an African country. This has got to be odd. Now, it might interest you to know that Oberon Waugh, as a younger man, used to write articles for Candour. I think mainly as a nom de plume, under nom de plumes, because he didn't want to blot his copybook. But if he wrote for Candour back in the mid-1950s, then he must have had some sense what Chesterton was all about, and Chesterton's opposition to Jury, international finance and all the rest of it. So he must have some clue about what was what. So, about some years ago, getting on 15, 20 years ago now, he wrote an article in the Sunday Telegraph in which he encountered a female. He relates in this article that he encountered at a health farm that he used to go to regularly, presumably in the sweat room. He encountered a Jewess who worked for the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Now, I relate this incident in one of the pamphlets I've published since I ceased to be involved in any particular organisation. This leaflet here, whoops, Out of Control, which deals with the formation of the Jewish spook organisation, the Community Security Trust. Some of you may have heard of that organisation. And in this pamphlet, I refer to Oberon Waugh and his writings as follows, and you can now judge whether he's the sort of patriotic British person who a nationalist organisation should support or not. This is what I wrote. About 10 years ago, the columnist and literary critic Oberon Waugh confided to the Sunday Telegraph readers that he had once encountered a female Board of Deputies employee at a health farm who told him, "We've got a file on you." She later admitted that the board even kept files on people who wrote to local papers opposing the fluoridation of the water supply. Hoping to exorcise any anti-Semitic ghosts in his past and thereby to brighten his future, he wrote a "Why I Could Never Be Anti-Semitic" article in the Jewish Chronicle of the 4th of August 1995. Referring to his health farm encounter, he picked over every possible event in his life which might have prompted Jewish suspicion and remarked, "There is always something alarming about the idea of a secret file which you have no right to inspect or quarrel with. What could have been in it? No doubt the file has passed from hand to hand, being communicated in whispers and barely discernible twitches of the eyebrow wherever rich and powerful Jews congregate. Perhaps it explained why my autobiography never found an American publisher." And I ask, did his anxious frettings move to pity the hearts of those whose eyebrow twitchings can blight careers? Or did they merely delectate over the wriggling of a worm on its hook, muttering, pour encourager les autres? So, that was my first taste of Roman Catholicism trying to influence the nationalist movement. Later on in the development of the NF, the nationalist movement was inflicted and disrupted by a group of people run by an Italian called Roberto Fiore. According to who was in the NF and also at one time said that he was contacted by Fiore and summoned down to Brighton, got them to open up bank accounts, found them accommodation, they got bath, took them out to Marks and Spencer's and kitted them all out with clothes. And this organisation intruded into the National Front. They set up a group at the home of Rosine de Bourneville, who was one of Leslie Green's colleagues. Also, she describes herself as a counter-reformationist Roman Catholic. That means that she wants the authority of the Roman Catholic Church to be restored to what it was before Henry VIII. So we could look forward to plenty of nice roastings and burnings at Smithfield. I discovered in 1980 that this group Rising, which was run by Fiore, was holding secret seminars at Rosine de Bourneville's house at Liss Forest in Hampshire, where leading young members of the National Front were approached by, as individuals, secretly by a man called Derek Holland, who was in the National Front, and invited to come. And of course, when you're 18, 19 or 20, the prospect of something secret and conspiratorial, and you mustn't tell anybody about it, and they'll be camping down in the countryside, and I do mean under tents, in the countryside, and it's all, and as it happened, I was doing a tour of the NF in Scotland in August of that year, 1983, and a young chap from Scotland in the NF said, "Oh, you're going back to London, could I hitch a lift with you?" And he spent the whole of the drive from Edinburgh back into London talking about all sorts of subjects, but carefully didn't mention that from London he was going down to Liss Forest, where he was going to meet with a lot of other young National Front leaders, junior National Front leaders like himself, and that he wasn't to talk about it to the likes of me or anybody else senior in the NF. And that, of course, this of course is typical Italian politics, conspiratorial subversion. When I raised this at the Directorate, there were some young people on the Directorate, namely Joe Pearce and Nick Griffin, who were all for this conspiracy. And I pointed out that our then chairman, John Temple had left the party by that stage, and our chairman was Andrew Bronze, that Andrew Bronze had introduced a motion which was carried by the membership at, I think, the 1980 AGM, that anybody standing for the Directorate of the National Front, the governing body of the party, had to sign a declaration that if elected to the Directorate, they would give the whole of their loyalty to the National Front. This was done by Bronze in order to protect the party from Freemasonic infiltration. But in fact, it was the Roman Catholics he should have been looking at, not the Freemasons on that particular occasion. This caused a tremendous amount of kerfuffle, and I won't go into the boring details, but eventually, as a result of this terrible row, because I would not accept Nick Griffin's formula, when I confronted him with this at a Directorate meeting, he says, "I will give 99% of my political loyalty to the National Front." Now, 1% is a crack into which a wedge can be fitted. You either honour a promise to give the whole of your loyalty to the party, or you don't take that promise and you don't sit on the directorate. Anyway, there was a bust-up, and the National Front and I parted company. After 14, 15 years of it, I was glad of the rest, to tell you the truth. And then, shortly before I left, there was another saga, which is within my personal knowledge within the nationalist movement, the saga of Joe Pearce, who was the leader of the Young National Front and editor of the Bulldog paper, some of you may remember. Now, in 1982, I think that's correct, to the best of my recollection, I attended Joe's marriage to a skinhead girl called Gina. They were married at a Methodist church in Barking. Gina, let us say, was it was obvious that their relationship had been consummated. Long before she tottered up the aisle, and I was of the opinion that she was lucky to get through the service without her waters breaking. But at any rate, Joe married her. Later, with power struggles going on between Joe Pearce and Nick Griffin in the NF after I'd left it, the parties divided into all sorts of crazy factions, and oh God, I was so relieved not to be involved in that madhouse. But Nick Griffin had promised Joe that on the second occasion that Joe deliberately got himself put into prison, that Nick wouldn't engage in any more splinter group activity, any more splitting of factionalism until Joe came out. And of course, the moment Joe was away for another 6 months, Nick got on with the usual business of splinter group activity of all kinds. We know the kind of man that he is. And so Joe, having done 2 stretches of 6 months in prison, started to get disillusioned with the National Front and politics generally. This disillusionment with the NF coincided with his interest in the works of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, who were 2 Edwardian and early 20th century Roman Catholic writers. This interest came to the ears of the various Catholics like Leslie Green, who had worked for the man that Oberyn Wall wanted to speak to, that I've mentioned a little earlier, Rosine de Bourneville, and Chesterton's number 2 man, a teacher called Aidan Mackey, who, for a moment after Chesterton left the party, was temporary acting chairman of the National Front. So he had a close association with the League of Empire Lawyers and with the National Front and on its directorate. And the moment they realised that this rising young star of nationalism was unhappy with the party he was in and was taking an interest in Roman Catholic writing and that sort of thing, immediately they honed in on him like flies around a jam pot. And they did what all cults do when they recruit. They engage in an exercise known as love bombing, where they give people loads of attention, loads of affection, loads of advice, loads of help, there all the time. Leslie Green had married a man called Richard von Goetz, and so she was then Mrs. von Goetz, and I should just mention that the sister of Richard von Goetz was Barbara von Goetz, who was secretary to George Lincoln Rockwell, the boss of the American Nazi Party. So it's a very tangled web. But that's a side issue, but it just goes to show what a small world it is, you know. And Joe became cultivated. Leslie von Goetz's daughter, pretty girl, came down, I think, from Cambridge University to cultivate Joe.
Oxford.
Oxford, was it? Ah, you're an Oxford man knows.
No, I'm a Cambridge man.
Oh, right, well, whatever. She came from a posh university and she and she was a very pretty girl, and Joe was obviously smitten. Who wouldn't be if, you know, that was the scenario. And this cultivation and Joe's loneliness unsettled him tremendously. And he left Gina, who had to go and live in what the Americans call a trailer park in Bungay in East Anglia with their 2 children. So he abandoned his children, he abandoned Gina in order to investigate G.K. Chesterton and the ins and outs of Roman Catholic dogma. And he came under the instruction of a traditionalist Catholic priest, the most prominent man doing that sort of thing in those days, who now I understand has translated himself to Australia. They deserve it after the cricket business. But Joe realised that if he was to have a career in literature, which was being offered to him, and a new life away from the National Front, he couldn't continue to be married to a skinhead girl with 2 brats living in a trailer park in Bungay. And so the people who were advising him somehow contrived for Joe to get an annulment. Now, all of you know enough about the Catholic Church, I hope you realise, the Catholic Church does not permit divorce. What it does permit, though, is annulment. That there are certain rules that if a marriage hasn't been conducted properly, or if the marriage hasn't been consummated, and in fact, if you care to read a book by one of the Calvin brothers called The Prince's Person, he's got the documents of the Roman Catholic annulment proceedings between a young aristocratic man who was a bit of a fop and a very red-blooded young lady, and the boy wasn't up to the job, and the cardinals assembled and they had to determine whether the marriage had been consummated, and this was done according to the criteria of erexio, introductio, emissio. And to determine those points, an awful lot of interesting examinations were conducted on both the boy and the girl by these nonagerian dribbling cardinals. Not a very uplifting... But the particular wriggle or wrinkle that Joe's advisors put forward to the bishop, who was able to rule on this matter, was that at the time Joe was married to Gina at the Methodist Church, which is for hundreds of people, he was too young to understand the nature of the vows that he was taking. They couldn't do non-consummation because, as I say, Gina was well on the way as she staggered up the aisle. And this was accepted. And it was accepted, so I'm told, this is our rumour, and I specify this is rumour, because at the time he was applying for this annulment, he canvassed the idea that if he ceased to be married, he not only wanted to convert to Roman Catholicism, but he wished to become a priest. And the church now, as you know in England, and certainly a few years ago, was desperately short of priests, and the idea of not only recruiting Joe Pearce, who was once mingling with Northern Ireland Protestants in Northern Ireland and selling Northern and Ulster loyalist literature about in England, not only would they won over a racist and an anti-Catholic bigot, but somebody who would not only join the Catholic faith but become a priest, was a prize to be grasped at. And it's ridiculous because at the time that Joe married Gina, he'd been a member of the National Front for some years, he'd got himself elected onto the National Directorate of the National Front, and he was editor of a newspaper. The idea that somebody could do that wasn't competent to understand the meaning of the vows of holy matrimony is just a nonsense. But the Catholic Church accepted it, and he became recruited and confirmed into the Roman Catholic Church. And you know, suddenly, shortly after that, all that happened, he lost his vocation to be a priest. What a surprise! And then was published a book by Joe about G.K. Chesterton, with the blurb on the back, lovely saintly photograph of Joe looking, I've been saved. Not like the photograph he had on the back of Bulldog. Looking, hate. You know, it was piety itself on the back there. And an article by Aidan Mackey, and a Bodley, Hodder and Stoughton Publishing Company book about G.K. Chesterton. And in all the biography which Aidan Mackie gave about Joe, he never mentioned that he was not merely Joseph Pearce, as he'd then become, but he was the Joe Pearce of the National Front, of the Young National Front, twice in prison for inciting racial hatred. All the rest. That was completely forgotten and not used. The book was circulated to the mass media, huge reviews were given to it, but in the Sunday Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph, various other papers that have got Catholic influences in them. It was only later when they discovered that they'd been conned. There was absolute uproar. And Joe quickly was parcelled up by the Catholic Church and sent to, I think it's Our Lady's University in Florida, which was built and paid for by the billionaire who owns Domino's Pizzas, who has announced that he regularly receives visitations from Our Blessed Lady, and who contradicts a billionaire who builds you universities. The last significant news I heard of Joe was an article he'd written in his newspaper, the St. Augustine's Chronicle, Star, in which he showed a photograph of his wife and himself, I think. But at any rate, he said, we're married and we've just had our first child. Well, that was certainly true in the case of the girl, but it was a lie in the case of Joe. He'd got at least 2 other children in the trailer park at Bungay. No mention of his annulment, and he was promoted high enough so that he was granted a personal audience by Pope John II in the Vatican. And Joe pronounced that the Pope was certainly a very holy man. It's a good thing that the Pope got Joe Pearce's imprimatur and nihil obstat. So that was now Joe has completely left the nationalist movement. He attacks the nationalist movement at every opportunity. He's written a book where he declares that he's so grateful to have been rescued from the hell of racism and has been drawn to forgiveness at the well of mercy. So this did the nationalist movement no good at all, and the whole saga is redolent with lies, deception, and crooked dealing. So these are, I could go into greater detail, but I won't bore you with it. These are my own personal experience of religious infiltration and manipulation of the nationalist movement that I was most involved with, the National Front, in my time. And I want to turn to historical matters outside my own personal experience, but recorded in history. Galileo. The word Galileo was mentioned by Bishop Williamson when he was speaking to us earlier this year, I think, at the Bloomsbury, at a hotel in Bloomsbury. Unfortunately, Bishop Williamson didn't go into the matter of the ins and outs of Galileo and why the church persecuted him, but we can get some idea of what happened to Galileo, if you'll forgive me. I'll read out just 2 small parts of the Holy Office indictment of Galileo, promulgated in 1630 AD. Whereas you, Galileo, son of the late Vincenzio Galilei of Florence, aged 70 years, were denounced in 1615 to this holy office for holding as true a false doctrine taught by many, namely, that the sun is immovable in the centre of the world and that the earth moves, and also with a diurnal motion, also for having pupils for whom you instructed in the same opinions, also for maintaining a correspondence on the same with some German mathematicians, also for publishing certain letters on sunspots. Therefore, invoking the most holy name of the Lord Jesus Christ and his most glorious Mother Mary, we pronounce our final sentence. We pronounce, judge and declare that you, the said Galileo, have rendered yourself vehemently suspected by this holy office of heresy. that is, of having believed and held the doctrine which is false and contrary to the holy and divine scripture, that the sun is at the centre of the world, and that it does not move from east to west, and that the earth does not move and is not the centre of the world. Also, that an opinion can be held and supported as probable after it has been declared and finally decreed contrary to Holy Scripture. And consequently, that you have incurred the censures and penalties enjoined and promulgated to the sacred canons and other general and particular constituents against delinquents of this description, from which it is our pleasure that you be absolved, providing that with a sincere heart and unfeigned faith in our presence you abjure, curse and detest the error and heresies and every other error and heresy contrary to the Catholic and Apostolic Church of Rome. And the poor old boy didn't want to be burned at the stake. He was 70. He was suffering grievously from arthritis, and I can understand that because I've got that problem. But in order to apologise properly to the cardinals of Holy Office, they made the old boy kneel on marble steps for hours. The torture of that, as these horrible old men in their plush thrones delectated over the suffering of this old man, as he poured scorn and detested his own provable and correct scientific work. He survived. I hope that there is nobody here who believes that the sun and the solar system revolves around the earth, because it ain't so, friends. But people were threatened with a stake and put to the stake for promulgating that. Before Galileo, there was Copernicus. I've been to Copernicus's rooms at the New World University at Krakow and seen his astrolabe. And it was Copernicus, more than even Galileo, who established the movement of the planets around the sun. That the church said, don't confuse us with facts and science. The scripture says that everything revolves around the earth. And if you promulgate any ideas contrary to that, we will burn you. And they did burn lots of people for promulgating that. Galileo knelt on his marble steps in agony and escaped. Now, you might think, and some people might say, oh, but that was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. The church has changed since those days. Nothing like that happens now. They haven't got that attitude at all. Well, people who say that have clearly never heard of the career of a Jesuit priest called Pierre de Chandin. He was active in science in the 1920s, 1925 particularly was his heyday year. Now that is still within living memory. He was a French philosopher and a Jesuit priest who trained as a paleontologist and a geologist and took part in the discovery of the Peking man. So he was obviously a learned fellow. And he involved himself a theory that at the very beginning, there is an absolute beginning of life in the universe, and that it's got a natural evolution out to an end. He reckons there is an end point in time. And that, don't begin to ask me how this fits in with theology or anything like that. It's completely beyond my ken. But he has this point of view, and he had scientific researches to be able to substantiate it, at any rate, to his satisfaction. And he also related this scientific opinion about the end of things with the doctrine of original sin, which is a crucial doctrine in Roman Catholic belief. Now, as I say, I couldn't begin to understand the complexities of these various scientific and theological beliefs. But what happened to Teilhard de Chardin? Was he simply told by his Jesuit order? Remember, the Jesuits are the intellectual SS of the Catholic Church. They were formed in order to guard the Church against deviancy and heretical belief. I think it's St. Ignatius of Loyola, a Spaniard, who set them up. And the church didn't tolerate him, he was ordered by the superior of the Jesuit order to leave France, leave his teaching post, and go to China, presumably on missionary work or some sort of scientific works, studies as well. And unless he signed a document abjuring and recanting and detesting the theories, scientific and theological, that he published, he would be expelled from the order of Jesuits and thrown out of the church. And he didn't want to lose, it was his living, he didn't want to lose his position in the church, he didn't want to leave the Jesuit order, of which he was greatly fond, and so he signed a document condemning his own ideas, which he believed. So the idea that there's been a fundamental change of mindset between the church dignitaries who condemned Galileo back in the Renaissance times and the princes of the church who dealt with Teilhard de Chardin at the beginning of the 20th century is shown not to be true. The mindset is the same. They haven't been able to burn people at the stake, but the mindset of wanting people to recant their ideas under sanction persists. There was another illustration of this mindset in the church. Again, it happens to a Frenchman, but this time at the beginning of the 19th century. A brilliant young Frenchman called Francois Champollion. Have any of you heard of him?
Egyptologist.
Exactly. Jolly good. Well, our professor here would know of him. He was born to a very poor peasant family in France with loads, I think 7 or 8 brothers and sisters. And yet by the time of 12, he was taking an interest in the Rosetta Stone, which people haven't been able to fully or at all translate, the 3 inscriptions that are on the Rosetta Stone. By the time of 16, he was speaking a dozen Middle Eastern languages, many of which were dead languages, by the age of 16. And by the age of 16, he was giving lectures and an address to the academics of Grenoble University on the ins and outs of the Coptic language, which was almost dead. And this is a boy of 16. Absolutely fantastic. And his idea was this. The Egyptian Empire lasted for more than 4,000 years. It was the most potent empire, probably the most significant empire, even including the British Empire, I'm afraid, that's been seen on this planet. Its buildings, its architecture, its science, its mathematics. I've toured Egypt once and visited numerous of the temples and seen how they managed to fit stones together, using no mortar, but only holding them together with sycamore pegs. The stones fitting together vertically and horizontally so close you couldn't get a cigarette paper between them. We don't have building skills like that today. So obviously, all the various achievements, the built environment that we can see, the remnant of Egypt, makes that civilization something very important for us to learn all about as much as possible. And Champollion, but nobody could read the hieroglyphics. We got the first bit of a clue, that humanity got the first bit of the clue with the Rosetta Stone, but he figured that a civilization as important as that, its language wouldn't disappear just when Cleopatra died and the Romans finally took over that area, wouldn't suddenly extinguish, that there would be remnants of people about the periphery of that empire who could speak or spoke some form of ancient Egyptian. And it was proved right. He, as a 16-year-old, he'd studied and mastered Coptic. And he went to the Coptic area south of Egypt, and bit by bit by bit, through his knowledge of linguistics and his natural genius, he was able to work out the demotics and the hieroglyphs, how they were mixed together, and he was able to figure out eventually not only how Egyptian demotics and hieroglyphics read, but to some extent, because of his contact with the Coptic people, he was able to speak ancient Egyptian. He was one of the most brilliant people of our civilization, which unfortunately nobody or very few people know about him. But you would imagine that a brilliant boy like that would be given every encouragement by everybody. But unfortunately for him, with the crushing of Napoleon at Waterloo, which was surely a good thing for us, the French reintroduced the monarchy, and with the monarchy they took in the baggage of the Roman Catholic Church, and they started operating in just the same greedy, selfish, oppressive way that had acted under the Louis. And the Church started inciting the authorities to hustle Champollion, to arrest him, to frustrate him, not let him travel. Why were they obstructing him? It's obvious. The Church had no mastery, no handle at all on ancient Egyptian. The ancient Egyptians were writing chronicles on papyrus as well as on their stones, and there are huge quantities of papyri left with writings on which are still being researched now. And the Church was frightened that at the time of Ramesses, for example, who I think was the emperor of Egypt, the pharaoh of Egypt, at the time of Joseph and the expulsion from Egypt of the Israelites, the Church was terrified that the accounts given of these events in the Bible, on which the Church based its identity, might be contradicted by contemporaneous ancient Egyptian records of the same event. And as the Church had no handle, no grip on ancient Egyptian, and this young lad and non-religiously involved academics were getting a handle on this, the power could possibly slip away from the Church to these young academics. And the Church did not want to allow that. It wanted to retain its power monopoly. So the boy had to jump about. He was helped by his brothers, and really he had to lurk about, fearing what it amounts to secret police harassment against him. Fortunately, they didn't stop his researches, and using the Rosetta Stone, which is in Greek, Demotic and hieroglyphics, they were able to find that those inscriptions were all saying the same thing but in different languages, and therefore they were able to translate. They knew what word in Greek represented what word in the Demotic or the hieroglyphic, and it was a wonderful step forward. There is so much literature, both in stone and on papyrus, that it's going to take centuries for us to understand it all, and for the scholars to figure it out. But the Church wanted it stopped. And finally, the final historical figure that I want to touch on, in England at any rate, was a person called William Tyndale.
Burnt at the stake for translation.
Exactly.
Into English.
Thank you, Richard. Burnt at the stake in Belgium.
In Belgium.
Because
Flanders, wasn't it?
Because this question of translating, you see, before the Renaissance, before the Reformation in England, we were a Catholic nation. Bishop Williamson says it was merry England, was it indeed? The squalor that the peasant people lived in was no better than the squalor that peasant people have been living in for the preceding 1,800 years. There was a slight increase in literacy amongst the non-clerical middle classes. But knowledge was the monopoly of the Church. And in particular, they kept the Bible, the New Testaments and the Old Testament, in Latin. Because if that was the document on which European civilization, and in our case British English civilization, was based, if that was the seminal document which our civilization was based, then to have the power to have only your own people who are sworn into holy orders able to read this information, and everybody else having to rely on those people for interpretation of this document, it was a tremendous grip you'd got on the population. And to begin with, the monarchs supported the Church in this, because the Church and the monarchs at that time were hand in glove, and the monarchs, as well as the Church, saw all the advantages in having a stupid, illiterate, trusting population, totally subservient to and reliant on the monarch and the Church. And Henry VIII was therefore desperately against the translation of Wycliffe and various other people before Tyndale who did the translation work. And these people were hunted down and burned at the stake. And the principal burner at the stake was the person who the Catholic Church made a saint, St. Thomas More. Now, all of you have probably seen the film, Robert Bolt's wonderful film, A Man for All Seasons. He's shown as a devout Catholic, a hero, standing up to Henry over the matter of the divorce. But before that, he and Henry were at one in hunting down people who tried to translate the Bible into the vernacular, into our English tongue. Tyndale was a brilliant genius, and he had to escape from England and go to Belgium, as our friend Richard Edmonds has just pointed out. But this saint hated people who wanted to translate the Bible into English so much that he condemned umpteen people to the stake. In one case, he hated the man so much that he couldn't wait for the fire to burn down and the embers to cool before he jumped into the middle of where the pyre had been and jumped up and down on the bones of the man he just witnessed being burnt to death, screaming abuse. On another occasion, he arranged for somebody who he hated, who was a would-be translator of the Bible, to have the fire lit in such a way, and the man positioned against it in such a way that he wasn't so much burnt to death as slowly roasted to death. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. So this was St. Thomas More. In the face of that kind of terrorism by the church, Tyndale disappeared to Belgium and worked. He had to constantly move about like a spy, or like a hunt. Well, he was a hunted person, and he was being hunted not only by Henry's secret police and the church's secret police, but sundry other monarchs about in Europe with their secret police, all wanted to burn him. And I think somebody, I think it was from Austria, their secret police, they introduced an Englishman into Tyndale's circle, and he betrayed him, and the man was burned. But by the time he was burned to death in a little village somewhere in Belgium, he translated all of the New Testament and the best part of the Old Testament. Now, one of the reasons why we haven't heard too much about William Tyndale and his contribution is that James I commissioned sundry scholars and bishops of the then new Church of England to translate, to produce a vernacular. But studies have been done of the King James Version, comparing it to Tyndale's translation, and they recognise that 70% of the text of the so-called King James Version was in fact produced by this brilliant man, William Tyndale. And just think of the words that you use in common parlance now. Turned the world upside down. Take root. The powers that be. Filthy lucre. No peace for the wicked. A fly in the ointment. Wheels within wheels. The blind leading the blind. Feet of clay. There are hardly any colloquialisms that you learned in with your mother's milk that didn't come from this genius, William Tyndale. But the church burned him. Now, if it hadn't been for William Tyndale unleashing the English language, we wouldn't have had a Shakespeare. But it was very fortuitous that Tyndale came upon the scene with his translation just at the time that Gutenberg had discovered the printing press and movable type. And no longer were books produced laboriously by hand with somebody in a scriptorium with a quill writing it out. Books could be manufactured on a factory line basis. And the books could then be spread out, and those who could afford to buy them could then read out the text to simple people who were unable to read, but they could still hear and understand words. And the words Tyndale used were words that were in their common parlance. Short, simple, monosyllabic, simple sentences with monosyllabic words that resonated with the English people and were made the basis of our poetry, not least the poetry of Shakespeare, who liberated us so much from so many points of view. He was a great, great British patriot, done more for the creation of England and the establishment of a culture of the English more than most other people in history I can think of. He's somebody we should form a William Tyndale society. But the church burned him. And you've got people on the fringes of our nationalist movement, like the late Rosine de Bourneville, who is a counter-Reformationist Roman Catholic. I'll conclude now by referring to two matters which are very much within our lifespan. Firstly, in Ireland, I've got here, I was in Dublin this September, and this picture struck me. It's by a man called Sir John Lavery. It's called The Blessing of the Colours. It shows a young soldier from not the IRA, but the new Irish government's army, kneeling before a spectre of the bishop behind him, and a young lad holding up a holy book to the bishop. And it shows the nation kneeling. In effect, the symbolism of this is the young Irish nation kneeling before the church, because the government of Ireland had established a concordat with the Catholic Church, whereby the Catholic Church was given special privileges in Ireland in return for the Catholic Church's benediction on the secular Irish government. Now, if you're a simple Irish person brought up in the Catholic faith back in the 1920s, that must have been a very moving picture to see. A mixture of Catholicism and patriotism. But how did the Catholic Church reward the Irish people for this concordat? It set up one institution, the laundries, in Dublin, whereby girls who had fallen pregnant, sometimes by their own brothers or fathers or uncles, sometimes as a result of rape, but sometimes as a result of love affairs, naive little girls who don't know the facts of life suddenly find themselves in the club. These girls were described as fallen women, and they were taken by their families for shame to these laundries, nunneries run by the Catholic Church in Dublin. And once they had their babies, they'd hardly begun to suckle them before the babies were snatched from them and kidnapped and given to respectable Irish married couples who for some reason or other couldn't have babies and wanted to adopt one. So the babies were dragged from the breast of their natural mothers and given in adoption without the how do you do or by your leave of the girl who was suckling them. And those girls were then put to work in the laundries, laundering the vestments for priests all over Ireland. And it was a cash business. And those girls worked, apart from the food they got and the wretched clothing they received, they worked for nothing. It was slave labour. And those worked on throughout the history of the Republic of Ireland, and that system carried on until the 1960s, which is well within living memory. And the Irish government, through the Concordat, was behind this system, and where girls escaped from the laundries, and they were found, the Garda would arrest them and drag them back and hand them back to the nuns again. The church has got a lot to apologise for in Ireland. That's quite separate from the abuse of children, boys and girls, in schools. Physical and sexual abuse. Quite separate. The story of those laundries is so wicked. Now, we had here a chap called Larry, speaking here, Larry...
Whitehurst.
No.
He spoke, they are making war on us.
Larry Whitehurst.
Yes. And he mentioned this final point that I'm about to raise, that after the Second World War, poor children and orphan children of the working classes of our people here in Britain were sent by the government to Australia. Now, I'm all for the White Australia policy, And I approved of the £10 pond schemes where whole families were translated to Australia. We want to preserve that as a white nation. Whether that will happen now or not, I don't know. But these were children who were sent, groups of them, to Australia. And the horror of it was that this wasn't just done, as Larry intimated, just by the church or big business. It was a business deal organised between the British government and the Catholic Church. And the children were then taken to the dockside somewhere in Australia, I don't know whether it's Sydney or wherever, whatever dockside it was, and brothers and sisters who were brought up together and who'd come across the world together were suddenly wrenched apart, never to see each other again. The boys were put into schools, well, certainly they were fed and given an education, but they were put to work as navvies, building churches, schools, and various other institutions that the church wanted to use. And they were using these kids as cheap labour, slave labour, whereas the girls were put into laundry facilities or dining facilities or vestment creating facilities, and they were put to sewing and working like that, exploited slave labour. And that is well within our lifetime. I was alive, just about, I was born in 43, when that sort of thing was going on. Now, I'll conclude by telling you this. I don't mind what religion people have got, but keep it separate from politics. Don't try and mix up your religion with the movement, and if, should ever it come, long after I'm under the sod, we have a nationalist government, don't form concordats with any religious group whatsoever. Keep religion in your mind and in your church and in your family circle, and always keep in your hearts and in your minds the courage and contribution of William Tyndale, who created English literature and gave soul to the British people. Don't allow yourself to be bullied and morally or emotionally blackmailed by religion. I regard it as a fantasy, but you're entitled to your view. The important thing is to concentrate on your nationalism. And if you do your duty to the end, then if there is a world after this world, then the deity will reward you for doing your duty. That's all you can expect. What you must do, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. Thank you.